This tutorial video from Precision Analytical is intended to assist you as you interpret your report for results. This is intended for providers to assist with their interpretation. If this is shared with patients, that's great, but do be aware that none of the comments from us are intended to usurp the role of the healthcare provider in that process. So do refer your questions as patients back to your healthcare provider. This is for our dried urine test for comprehensive hormones that we call Dutch. And we do have other educational videos on our website, so do be aware of those. Those are on various topics. For providers, if you would like a copy of this testing matrix, we distribute this to providers to just assist with the decision making in when to use serum, saliva, traditional urine testing, and our Dutch testing in different scenarios when you want to look at sex or adrenal hormones or different HRT scenarios. And if you have any questions on that, feel free to contact the laboratory. The report sets up such that pages 1 and 3 are kind of your classic lab report. So we're listing hormones like estrone, which is an estrogen metabolite, whether it's within range or not, what the value is, and then what that reference range is. So we list those and then we plot those graphically on the subsequent pages to give you those values in the context of the hormonal cascade. You can see an excerpt from that here. So it's kind of a speedometer style plotting, so you can see the reference range is listed between these two stars, and then here's that same estrone value from down here of 28.4, and it is out of range, which is why it's red, and it would be green if it was within range, and then yellow if it was low. So it's intended that you can get most of the information you need by glancing at those graphical pages. So we're just going to go through this one section at a time to give you an introduction to each section. And then if you have questions beyond that, feel free to contact us. For many of the providers, we'll also have for your first test a helpful interpretation video specific to your actual patient's results. So let's start with progesterone. Progesterone is unique in urine in that there really isn't very much progesterone in urine, so it's measured indirectly. So if you look at a hormone like estradiol, this is the chemical makeup of estradiol. So it's got these two hydroxy groups at the bottom of the steroid molecule, and then the form we find in urine, so that's the form you would measure in serum or in saliva. In urine, the form we measure are what are called phase 2 conjugates. So those are the water-soluble forms of those. And so you get this essentially this little sugar molecule that's attached to the hormone, and that makes it water soluble, and that's what we find in urine, and that's fairly reflective of the bioavailable hormone. Now those additions, those conjugation steps, happen exclusively on those hydroxy groups. If you look at the molecule for progesterone, it has no hydroxy group. It has these groups here, which are called ketone groups, which means progesterone doesn't end up in urine because it's not water soluble and it can't be conjugated. So first it gets turned into another molecule, and that molecule undergoes phase 2 conjugation, and that's what we find in urine. So beta-pregnanediol is the name of that compound. That's what most labs measure in urine, and that's been shown to track really well with serum progesterone. Now we know that half of progesterone also goes down an analogous alpha pathway, alpha-pregnanediol. So we measure them both. So you can see this particular patient happens to push her progesterone much more down the beta pathway than the alpha. So then what we plot here for progesterone is just a weighted average of the two, and that's probably the best reflection of overall progesterone status. So for this particular patient, on the higher side of normal, so good, strong progesterone production. As we look at the androgens, it's a pretty expansive panel for the androgens. So we want to look at overall androgen levels. So for DHEA levels, which are made by the adrenal glands mostly, we can see DHEAS, and then we can see its downstream metabolites here. These are the two most abundant androgens. And so you can see in this particular patient, one's normal, one's a little bit high. So the DHEA status looks normal to high. The testosterone, we're looking at testosterone itself, and then also these two downstream metabolites as well. So for testosterone, we're predominantly looking at testosterone, and it's low normal here. So she's on the lower side of normal for this sample report. But beyond those two, we want to look at DHT production, and this is what adds extra value to this test, but also some complexity. DHT, you can see it here on this schematic, is the most potent androgen, which is why it's relevant. Now we measure it, and you'll see it on page 1 of the comprehensive reports, but it's not a great marker for its own production, and here's why. Testosterone is mostly protein bound, and then the free hormone, that's what's available for phase 2 conjugation, which is then what ends up in urine. That can slip into the cell and be turned into DHT. It gets metabolized to dihydrotestosterone. And that's what interacts so heavily with the androgen or the testosterone receptor, and that's what makes it 3 times as potent as testosterone. The thing with DHT is it doesn't leave the cell as DHT. That's not happening much. It gets deactivated first to androstenediol. That's what leaves the cell. Now, that's all 5-alpha reductase metabolism. Alternately, it can get metabolized by 5-beta reductase, and those metabolites are not androgenic. So what we're looking at here is androgenic alpha metabolites versus non-androgenic beta metabolites. And what you can see with this particular patient is her testosterone is normal, her DHEAS is normal, but if you look at her metabolism, she really prefers the alpha metabolism here and alpha metabolism here. So her overall score for 5-alpha metabolism really pushes towards 5-alpha. That means at the tissue level, a lot of androgens are getting more androgenic. So a lot of times patients like this will have thinning scalp hair, maybe acne, maybe facial hair for female patients. And the reason for that is not necessarily the high levels of testosterone, but the even more potent DHT that's being made at very high levels at the tissue level. You can see testosterone's low normal, but a lot of it is pushing through this DHT pathway, and so we want to look at that overall picture. That's an advantage of this test, especially in your young, hormonally imbalanced patients, people with PCOS, and for the male patients, when we're looking at prostate issues, it's relevant as well. Now, for the estrogens, we're looking at overall estrogen levels here. So usually people just look at E2 in blood or saliva. We want to look at E1, E2, and E3. I believe this was actually a patient that was on some therapy, so she had some high levels of estriol because she was supplementing with that estriol and then taking a little bit of estrogen, and that's up, or estradiol, and that was within the normal range. But once we've established what the estrogen status is, we want to know about metabolism. Phase 1 metabolism is hydroxylation, and I use this example because it's an example of very poor phase 1 metabolism. These two metabolites, the 16 and the 4-hydroxy, are called the so-called bad estrogen metabolites, and the 2-hydroxy is a so-called good estrogen metabolite because it has some nice protective properties. Now you can see this one's pretty obvious. The 2 is low, the 4 is high, and the 16 is high. So that's not a good looking picture for the estrogen metabolites. The 4 makes a quinone, and that quinone can then attach to DNA and actually create DNA damage, and that's why it's problematic and carcinogenic. So the way we plot this is we plot what's normal is about 70% of the metabolites are 2-hydroxy, 10% are 4, and 20% are 16. So the 2 really outweighs those other 2, and that's what you want to see. But with this particular patient, the 2 is actually remarkably low, and the 4 and the 16 really have more than you'd like to see, so that's really not a good situation. People use things like DIM and indole 3-carbinol to try to push those estrogens down the 2-hydroxy pathway, but at first we want to just establish what's going on there. So once you've got hydroxylation, you can look at phase 2 metabolism, which is methylation. Now that's a protective step, also involved in neurotransmitters and with your DNA, and so it's very important that you methylate the estrogens well. This 4-hydroxy estrogen, you can protect against that by methylating. Now the methylation products of the 4 are not very easy to measure, so we're just looking at the 2, but you can see that the overall index for that methylation is pretty low for this patient. So she may need some support with both phase 1 and phase 2 metabolism, especially if she's going to stay on her estrogen therapy. Lastly, the adrenal piece. So for the adrenals, it's a very comprehensive look. In saliva testing, you get to look at the daily free cortisol pattern. We start with that. And this is a very normal pattern. So overnight, you expect the levels to be low. Then they pop up to within the normal range there in the morning, and then they should come down throughout the day and finish out low around bedtime. So that's a pretty nice looking profile. So once we've got this pattern, then we integrate the area under the curve, or you could just say we add them all up, and you get this number here, which is a calculation. That should just be thought of as a 24-hour urine-free cortisol. So you can see for this patient, it's within the normal range. And then what I'd like to do next is just confirm that sort of story, if you will, of sort of low normal cortisol production by looking at metabolized cortisol, because it is the best marker of overall production of cortisol. And you can see that's also on the lower side of normal, but a little bit closer to average there. So we're looking for those two to sort of tell the same story, if you will. And when they don't, it gets a little bit complex. So I'll show you a case of that here. So here's a patient that has low free cortisol. So typically, if you're just looking at this in saliva, you would say, okay, your free cortisol is low, you don't make much cortisol. But if you look at this patient, the metabolized cortisol is elevated. Now here's a patient who's making a lot of cortisol, but she's very rapidly clearing that cortisol out. You'll see that in long-term stress, obesity, hyperthyroidism. So that's the kind of thing why metabolized cortisol is so important, because this patient, if you conclude that her adrenals don't make any cortisol, it's actually somewhat misleading in terms of what's going on with her. She's making a good amount of cortisol, but she's really processing that cortisol rather rapidly. So for this particular patient, then the last piece is this cortisol-cortisone shuttle. Now what this shows is the active versus inactive cortisol. So cortisol is made. So we have stress, we have inflammation, and when those signals hit the brain ultimately makes ACTH. When ACTH hits the adrenal gland, they make cortisol. So cortisol then gets deactivated to cortisone in the kidney, in the colon, in the saliva gland very heavily, and then it goes out as cortisone and gets reactivated to the active cortisol in fat cells, in the liver, and elsewhere. So for this particular patient, she's really favoring just a little bit slightly but the active cortisol. Sometimes you'll get an interesting pattern where this piece of information of a very heavy deactivation or a very heavy activation of the cortisol really clears up this picture as to what's going on. You can get a normal free cortisol pattern, for example, because you have a little bit of cortisol being made, but that person's really holding on to the cortisol, really favoring that active form, which is very different than just a high production of cortisol overall. So we want to look at all the components of this picture if we're going to make sense of what's going on with the adrenal hormones and really make good decisions. So I hope this has been helpful. There should be, if you're a new provider, also coming to you a short tutorial that goes through just your results very quickly, so I can give you my thoughts on that. If you have some questions, we can definitely take some feedback and continue the conversation. For patients, again, this may be helpful to you in understanding some of the nuances of these results, but again, please do refer questions, and especially for treatment, back to your healthcare provider, and we thank you for your time and look forward to working with you. Oh, dang it. Oh, that wasn't smart. Still recording. That's probably not good.